Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and walk away. But I didn't. And that split-second decision, the one that made me step between 3 armed men and their target, would either save my life or destroy it completely. I was the last one in the lecture hall again. Nothing unusual about that. I always stayed late on Thursdays, taking extra time with my notes, reviewing formulas that refused to stick in my exhausted brain. Medical school was eating me alive. Second year, drowning in debt, working night shifts at the campus library just to afford instant ramen and textbooks. My scholarship covered tuition, but living in this city required more money than a girl from nowhere could scrape together legally. Not that illegal options hadn't crossed my mind. They crossed everyone's mind eventually in a city like this. But I'd made it this far on grades and grit. I wasn't about to throw it away for quick money that came with strings I couldn't afford. I gathered my anatomy textbook, my laptop, the 3 highlighters I'd worn down to nubs. The building was empty, echoing with that particular silence that comes after hundreds of students evacuate at once. Outside, October rain hammered against the windows, turning the campus into a blur of gray and gold. My phone buzzed. Text from my roommate Amy asking if I'd be home for dinner. I texted back that I'd grab something cheap on the way. Translation: I'd skip dinner because cheap still meant $5 I didn't have. The lecture hall door swung shut behind me with a hydraulic hiss. The hallway stretched ahead, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous song. I'd walked this path 1,000 times. Knew every crack in the tile, every motivational poster peeling from the walls. But tonight something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. Just a prickle at the base of my skull, an instinct honed from years of walking home alone through bad neighborhoods, of knowing when to cross the street, when to run. I slowed my pace, senses sharpening. That's when I saw them. 3 men at the end of the hallway near the exit. Not students. Too old, wrong energy. They wore expensive suits under raincoats, but their posture screamed violence. They stood too still, too focused, watching something outside through the glass doors. Waiting. My first instinct was to turn around, find another exit. Whatever they were doing, I wanted no part of it. But curiosity made me hesitate. Made me shift my position just enough to see what they were looking at. A man was approaching the building. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never been afraid of anything in his life. Dark hair plastered to his head from the rain, suit jacket slung over one arm. Even from this distance, even through rain-streaked glass, I could see he was handsome in that devastating way that usually meant trouble. He was walking straight toward an ambush and had no idea. The 3 men tensed. One of them reached inside his jacket. I knew that movement. Had seen it in movies, in news footage, in the nightmares I'd had since moving to this city. He was reaching for a gun. I should have run. Should have called campus security. Should have done literally anything except what I did next. I walked straight toward them. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. My hands shook, making my textbook rattle against my laptop. But I kept walking, kept moving forward like I belonged there, like I wasn't about to do the stupidest thing of my entire life. The man nearest to me noticed my approach. Turned to look at me with eyes that had seen too much violence to be surprised by a college student. I forced a smile. Bright, oblivious, the kind of smile girls use when they're trying to seem harmless. I said excuse me, asked if they knew where the campus clinic was. Said I wasn't feeling well, thought I might pass out. Could one of them help me? My voice shook. Not entirely fake. Terror had a way of making deception authentic. The men exchanged glances. Clearly annoyed by this interruption. The one who'd been reaching for his gun let his hand drop. I swayed slightly, putting a hand against the wall. Asked again for help, louder this time, my voice carrying. Outside, the approaching man had stopped. He was looking through the glass now, watching this scene unfold. Our eyes met for half a second and I saw recognition flash across his face. Not recognition of me. Recognition of what I was doing. He turned and walked away. Quickly. Casually. Like he'd just remembered something he'd left in his car. The three men saw it happen. Saw their target escape because some stupid college girl had chosen that exact moment to need medical attention. One of them swore. Looked at me with calculation that made my blood freeze. He asked what I'd seen. I blinked at him, confused. Said I'd just come from lecture. Was heading home. Felt dizzy. What was he talking about? He studied me for a long moment. I held my breath, praying my performance was convincing. Finally, he dismissed me with a gesture. Told me the clinic was in the student center 2 buildings over. Told me to take better care of myself. Then they left. All 3 of them walking out into the rain, disappearing into the October darkness. I stood there for 10 minutes after they were gone, heart racing, legs shaking, trying to process what I'd just done. I just saved someone from an ambush. Someone who was clearly involved in something dangerous. Someone who those men had planned to hurt or kill. I should have felt heroic. Instead, I felt terrified. Because heroes got noticed. And in this city, getting noticed by dangerous people was the fastest way to end up dead. I finally made it outside, rain soaking through my thin jacket within seconds. The campus was dark, mostly empty. I hurried toward the parking lot where my ancient Honda waited. That's when I saw the black car. Expensive. Thick. Engine running, headlights off. And leaning against the driver's side door watching me approach, was the man I'd just saved. He was even more handsome up close. Sharp features, dark eyes that seemed to see through me. Mid-30s maybe, with the kind of presence that made the air around him feel charged. He said one sentence and his voice was like smoke and velvet and warning all mixed together. He said, "Walk out and don't stop. Don't look back. Forget you ever saw me." Then he got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the rain, confused and terrified and somehow certain that my life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to understand. I should have listened to him. Should have walked out and not stopped just like he said. But curiosity had always been my fatal flaw. And I'd just become very, very curious about who I'd saved, and why someone wanted him dead badly enough to ambush him on a college campus. I didn't see him again for a week. I tried to forget. Focused on midterms, on my library shifts, on surviving another week of medical school's relentless grind. I told myself it was a one-time thing. A strange encounter. Nothing more. But I kept looking over my shoulder. Kept watching for those 3 men. Kept wondering if they'd realized I hadn't been as oblivious as I'd pretended. My roommate Amy noticed my jumpiness. Asked if something happened. I lied and said I was just stressed about exams. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press. On the 8th day I found a flower on my windshield. Not a bouquet. Just a single white rose, pristine despite the morning frost. No note. No explanation. Just a flower that definitely hadn't been there when I'd parked the night before. I looked around the parking lot. Empty. No one watching. No black cars lurking. I took the rose inside, put it in a water glass in my room. Told myself it was probably from a secret admirer. Some awkward pre-med student too shy to approach me directly. The next morning, another rose. Same spot. Same pristine white. This time there was a note. It said, "Thank you. You were brave when you didn't need to be." My hands shook holding that small card. The handwriting was elegant, controlled. Expensive paper. No signature. Amy saw the rose when she came home from her morning run. She squealed, asked who my mystery admirer was. Made jokes about romantic gestures. I laughed it off. Didn't tell her the truth. That this wasn't romance. This was something else entirely. On the 3rd morning, the rose came with a different note. It said, "You're being followed. Gray sedan. 2 men. They've been outside your building since Tuesday." Ice flooded my veins. I spun around, scanning the parking lot. Found the gray sedan immediately. 2 men inside, both watching my building with professional focus. I stood there frozen, rose in hand, terror clawing at my throat. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. A voice I recognized instantly spoke in my ear. He told me to get in my car. Drive normally. Follow his instructions exactly. He said he'd make sure I got to campus safely. I asked who he was. He said someone who owed me a debt. And debts in his world were paid in full. I should have hung up. Should have called the police. Should have done anything except what I did. I got in my car and followed his instructions. He guided me through side streets away from main roads. His voice stayed calm the entire time, directing turns, telling me when to speed up, when to slow down. The gray sedan tried to follow, but somehow we lost them in a maze of residential neighborhoods. 20 minutes later, I pulled into a coffee shop parking lot in a part of the city I'd never visited. Safe. Populated. Nowhere the men from that sedan could corner me without witnesses. He told me to go inside, order whatever I wanted. He'd take care of the bill. Then he hung up. I sat in my car for 5 minutes, shaking. Then I went inside because what else could I do? The coffee shop was cozy, warm, filled with the smell of espresso and fresh pastries. I ordered a latte I couldn't afford and a croissant I definitely didn't need. When I went to pay, the barista smiled. Said my order was covered. Pointed to a table in the corner where an envelope sat waiting. Inside was $300 in cash. And another note. It said, "For the groceries you're not buying. For the meals you're skipping. For being the kind of person who helps strangers even when it's dangerous." Below that, in the same elegant handwriting, "They won't follow you again. I've made certain of it. But be careful. You're brave, Sophia Chen. Sometimes that's the same as being reckless." He knew my name. I should have been terrified. Should have run to the police, reported everything. Instead, I pocketed the money, drank my lot, ate my croissant, and wondered who this man was and how he'd managed to find out everything about me in just 8 days. More importantly, I wondered what kind of trouble I'd invited into my life by saving him. The answer came 2 weeks later when he showed up at the library where I worked. The library closed at midnight on weeknights. I usually worked until closing, then spent an extra hour reshelving books in the silence. The pay was terrible, but it was quiet work that let me study between tasks. I was in the medical section, arms full of anatomy textbooks, when I heard footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Not the shuffle of a tired student. I turned and there he was. The man from the ambush. From the phone calls. From the mysterious notes and roses that had stopped appearing after that coffee shop morning. He looked different in the fluorescent lighting. Less dangerous somehow, though no less handsome. He wore dark jeans and a leather jacket, dressed down from the suit I'd seen him in before. He said my name. Just that. Sophia. I asked what he was doing here. Told him the library was closed. He said he knew. That he'd waited until everyone else left. That he needed to talk to me privately. I should have screamed. Should have run. Should have done literally anything except stand there with my arms full of textbooks, staring at this stranger who'd invaded my workplace. Instead, I asked if I was in danger. He said yes. But not from him. He told me to put down the books. To sit. To listen. I did, because something in his voice made disobedience feel impossible. He sat across from me at one of the study tables. Kept his distance, hands visible, posture open. Everything about his body language said he wasn't a threat. But we both knew that was a lie. He introduced himself properly. Said his name was Dante Russo. Said I'd probably heard of his family if I'd lived in this city long enough. I had. The Russos were, well, everyone knew what they were. Old money with dirty origins. Legitimate businesses built on illegitimate foundations. Power that extended from boardrooms to back alleys. My face must have shown my recognition because he smiled sadly. He said yes, that Russo. The one people whispered about. The one whose family controlled half the city's underground economy. I asked why those men wanted to kill him. He said because his family was trying to change. To go legitimate. To leave behind the violence and crime that had built their empire. Not everyone approved of that decision. Some people preferred the old ways. Those 3 men had been sent by a rival faction. A message. A warning. I disrupted that message by helping him escape. He told me they'd figured out who I was. Had been following me, trying to decide if I was an ally or just an unlucky bystander. If I was someone who needed to be eliminated or just scared into silence. I asked which I was. He said he'd convinced them I was just a naive student who'd needed medical attention at exactly the wrong moment. Pure coincidence. Nothing to worry about. But that protection came with conditions. I had to stay away from him. Had to forget I'd ever seen him. Had to go back to my normal life and pretend none of this had happened. The money he'd left was a final payment. A debt settled. After tonight we'd never see each other again. I should have been relieved. Should have thanked him and agreed immediately. Instead I asked why he was really here. If he'd truly settled the situation, why risk coming to see me again? Why not just disappear and let me move on? He was quiet for a long time. Then he admitted the truth. He said he couldn't stop thinking about what I'd done. About the fact that I'd risked my life for a complete stranger without hesitation. That kind of courage was rare. That kind of selflessness didn't exist in his world. He said he'd been researching me. Learning about my scholarship, my debt, my night shifts and skipped meals. About my mother back home who I sent money to every month even though I could barely feed myself. He said I was exactly the kind of person his world destroyed. Good. Pure. Trying to make something of myself through legitimate means. And he couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let me keep struggling when he had resources to help. I told him I didn't want his charity. Didn't want to be some redemption project for a guilty crime lord trying to buy his way into heaven. His expression hardened. He said it wasn't charity. It was payment for a service rendered. I'd saved his life. In his world that created a debt that couldn't be ignored. He'd set up a scholarship fund. Anonymous. No strings attached. Enough to cover my living expenses for the rest of medical school. I wouldn't have to work night shifts anymore. Wouldn't have to skip meals. All I had to do was accept it and walk away. I asked what he got out of it. He said peace of mind. The knowledge that at least one good person in this city wasn't being crushed by circumstances he could easily fix. It was such a carefully constructed lie. So obviously about more than charity or debt. I called him on it. Told him I wasn't stupid. Asked what he really wanted. He stood up, then moved around the table. Stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. He said he wanted me to be safe. To finish school. To become the kind of doctor who actually gave a damn about her patients. To be everything this city needed and rarely got. And he wanted to know that somewhere in this dark, violent world he inhabited, there was one person who'd looked at him and seen someone worth saving instead of someone to fear. Then he did something that changed everything. He touched my face. Just a brush of his fingers against my cheek. Reverent. Like I was something precious he was afraid to break. He told me I reminded him of someone. His sister. She'd wanted to be a doctor too. Had the same fierce determination, the same selfless courage. She'd been killed 6 years ago. Caught in crossfire meant for him. 19 years old. Full of promise. He'd built an empire trying to make her death mean something. Trying to create a world where other sisters, other daughters, other brave girls didn't have to die for men's wars. I asked if that's why he was going legitimate. Trying to leave the violence behind. He said yes. But it was harder than he'd thought. You couldn't just walk away from power. You had to fight for every step toward the light. And sometimes people died in that fight. I asked if he was going to die. He said probably. Men in his position rarely lived long enough to enjoy retirement. But maybe if he was very lucky and very careful, he could last long enough to actually change things. I made a decision then. One I'd probably regret. One that defied every piece of advice I'd ever received about staying out of trouble. I told him I'd accept his scholarship. On one condition. He looked wary. Asked what condition. I said he had to let me check on him. Once a month. Just to make sure he was still alive. Still fighting toward the light. Because if he died before finishing what he'd started, I wanted to know. wanted to grieve properly for the man who'd seen me as something worth protecting. He studied me for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it transformed his face from intimidating to devastating. He said I was either the bravest or most foolish person he'd ever met. I said they were usually the same thing. He laughed. Actually laughed. Warm and genuine and completely at odds with everything I knew about him. Then he agreed to my terms. He gave me a number. Told me to call once a month. He'd always answer. He left after that, disappearing into the October night like a shadow made flesh. I sat in the empty library for another hour, trying to process what had just happened. I just made a deal with a mafia boss. Had inserted myself into his life in a way that was probably dangerous and definitely stupid. But I couldn't stop smiling. Because for the first time since moving to this city, someone had seen me. Really seen me. Not as a scholarship kid or a library worker or another desperate student drowning in debt. He'd seen me as someone brave. Someone worth protecting. Someone who mattered. And that feeling was more addictive than any drug. I called him on the 1st of November. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was warm, slightly amused. He said he'd been wondering if I'd actually follow through. I said I kept my promises. We talked for 20 minutes. Careful conversation. Surface-level topics. He asked about school, about whether the scholarship money had arrived. I asked if he was staying safe, if the people who wanted him dead had backed off. He said safety was relative. But he was still breathing. Still pushing toward legitimacy. Before we hung up, he asked if I'd had dinner. I admitted I hadn't. Too busy studying for exams. He made me promise to eat something. Told me brilliant minds needed fuel. The next morning I found groceries on my doorstep. Good groceries. Fresh vegetables, real meat, quality staples. Enough to last 2 weeks. No note needed. I knew who'd sent them. Amy was suspicious. Asked if I had a sugar daddy I wasn't telling her about. I said it was scholarship benefits. She didn't believe me but dropped it. December's call lasted 40 minutes. We talked about his childhood, about growing up in a family where violence was currency and loyalty meant everything. About his sister, whose death had broken something in him that could never fully heal. I told him about my mother. About growing up poor in a small town. About watching her work 3 jobs trying to give me opportunities she never had. About the guilt of leaving her behind to pursue medical school in a city that ate people alive. He said guilt was proof we were still human. That the day we stopped feeling it was the day we became monsters. I asked if he still felt guilt. He said every single day. By January the calls had become the highlight of my month. I found myself looking forward to them, preparing topics to discuss, storing up stories to share. He sent books. Medical texts I couldn't afford. Novels he thought I'd enjoy. Each one with a small note in his elegant handwriting. This one made me think of you. This might help with your cardiology rotation. Read this when you need to remember why you're doing this. Amy caught me smiling at one of the notes. She said whoever he was, I was falling for him. I denied it. Said we were just friends. She laughed. Said people didn't look at friendship notes like they were love letters. I didn't have a good response to that. In February everything changed. I called on the 1st like always. But this time he didn't answer. I tried again. Voicemail. I told myself he was busy. That men like Dante Russo had complicated lives that didn't revolve around monthly check-ins with college students. But dread settled in my stomach like lead. I tried again the next day. And the day after. A week passed with no response. I was debating whether to report him missing when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered and Marcus's voice came through. Rough, weary, tinged with something that sounded like grief. He said his name was Marcus Costa. That he worked for Dante Russo. That Dante had asked him to call if something ever happened. My throat closed. I asked if Dante was dead. Marcus said no. But barely. There'd been an attempt. A bomb in his car. He'd survived but was in critical condition. The doctors weren't sure if he'd make it. I asked which hospital. Marcus hesitated. Said it wasn't safe. That the people who'd tried to kill Dante might try again. That anyone associated with him was at risk. I said I didn't care. Told him which hospital. I demanded to know. Marcus sighed. Then he told me. St. Michael's. Private wing. Under a false name. I hung up and grabbed my coat. Amy asked where I was going. I said a friend needed me. She looked at me seriously. Told me to be careful. Said I'd been different since October. More distracted. More secretive. She said whatever I was involved in, it felt dangerous. I told her everything was fine. Another lie in a growing collection. St. Michael's private wing looked more like a hotel than a hospital. Carpeted hallways, artwork on the walls, the illusion of comfort over clinical efficiency. I gave Dante's false name at the desk. The nurse studied me with obvious suspicion. Asked how I knew the patient. I said I was a medical student doing a rotation. That he'd requested to see me. She didn't believe me but made a call anyway. 5 minutes later Marcus appeared. The same Marcus I'd spoken to on the phone. He was massive, scarred, looked like violence personified. But his eyes were kind when they met mine. He asked if I was Sophia Chin. I nodded. He said Dante had been asking for me. Had been barely conscious but kept repeating my name. My chest tightened. I followed Marcus down the hallway, past security checkpoints, through doors that required special clearance. Dante's room was at the end. Armed men stood outside. They stepped aside for Marcus, watching me with calculating eyes. Inside the room was dim. Machines beeped steadily. For lines ran into bandaged arms. Dante lay in the hospital bed, face pale, breathing shallow. He looked smaller somehow. Vulnerable. Human in a way I'd never seen him. I moved to his bedside, hand finding his. His skin was cold. Marcus said he'd been asking for me for 2 days. Barely lucid but insistent. I asked what the doctor said. Marcus's expression darkened. Said the next 48 hours were critical. Internal injuries. Burns. Shrapnel they were still removing. He'd lost a lot of blood. I asked who did this. Marcus said the same faction that had tried before. The ones opposed to Dante's legitimacy plans. They'd gotten bolder, more desperate. I asked if they'd be back to finish the job. Marcus said not if he had anything to say about it. Security was tight. No one was getting near Dante again. I sat with Dante for 3 hours. Holding his hand. Talking to him even though he couldn't respond. Telling him about my exams, about the book he'd sent me, about how stupid he was for getting himself blown up. Around hour 4 his eyes flickered open. He looked at me disoriented. Confused. Then recognition dawned. He whispered my name. Asked if I was real. I told him I was. Told him he was an idiot. Told him he'd promised to stay alive and he was doing a terrible job of it. He smiled weakly. Said he'd always been bad at keeping promises. Asked what happened. He said he'd gotten careless. Too confident. Had thought they wouldn't try again so soon after the first attempt. He'd been wrong. I asked if he was scared. He said yes. Not of dying. Of leaving things unfinished. Of failing the people depending on him. Of never seeing me again. That last part was so quiet I almost missed it. I squeezed his hand. Told him he wasn't allowed to die. That I hadn't saved him from that first ambush just to let him get blown up in a parking garage. He laughed, then winced in pain. Said I was bossy for someone who'd only known him a few months. I said someone needed to boss him around. His own people clearly weren't doing a good enough job keeping him alive. He told me I was beautiful when I was angry. I told him he was delirious from pain medication. He said maybe. But he meant it anyway. We stayed like that for another hour. Just sitting together. His hand in mine. The machines beeping their steady rhythm. Eventually Marcus came back. Said visiting hours were over. That I needed to leave before anyone noticed I wasn't supposed to be there. I started to protest. Dante squeezed my hand. He told me to go. To be safe. To focus on school and forget about him. I said I wasn't very good at following instructions. He said he'd noticed. Before I left, I did something impulsive. I leaned down and kissed his forehead. Brief. More promise than romance. I told him I'd be back tomorrow. And the day after. And every day until he was well enough to throw me out himself. He said that might take a while. I said good. I was patient. Marcus walked me out. In the hallway he thanked me for coming. Said Dante had been in a dark place before I arrived. That seeing me had given him something to fight for. I asked Marcus to keep me updated. To call if anything changed. He said he would. Then he asked me a question that made my blood run cold. He asked if I understood what I was getting into. If I knew what it meant to care about someone in Dante's position. I said I was starting to. He said it meant being a target. Meant being used as leverage. Meant living with constant fear that someone would hurt you just to hurt him. He asked if I was prepared for that. I said no. I wasn't prepared at all. But I was doing it anyway. Because some people were worth the risk. Marcus studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded like I'd passed some test. He said Dante was lucky to have me. I said Dante was lucky to be alive. Marcus smiled grimly. Said we'd see how long that luck lasted. I left the hospital as dawn was breaking. Exhausted. Terrified. Strangely exhilarated. I'd just inserted myself into a war I didn't understand. Had declared myself loyal to a man who had enemies powerful enough to plant bombs in his car. It was possibly the stupidest thing I'd ever done. But seeing him alive, seeing him smile, seeing him look at me like I mattered, that had been worth every risk. And I was starting to realize that what I felt for Dante Russo went far beyond gratitude or curiosity or the simple desire to help. I was falling in love with him. And in his world, love was the most dangerous weapon anyone could wield against you. I visited Dante every day for 2 weeks. My excuse to the hospital staff evolved. I claimed to be a medical student doing independent study on trauma recovery. The nurses eventually stopped questioning me, especially after Marcus started bringing coffee for everyone on duty. Money opened doors. Even in hospitals. Dante improved slowly. The doctors were amazed by his resilience. I wasn't. Men like Dante Russo didn't survive in his world by being easy to kill. We talked for hours. About everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a family where trust was currency and betrayal meant death. About watching his father build an empire on violence and fear. About deciding he wanted something different. I told him about medical school's brutality. About patients I'd met during rotations. About the moment I'd decided to become a doctor. Watching my neighbor die from a treatable condition because she couldn't afford insurance. He said we were alike. Both trying to fix broken systems. His through power and reformation. Mine through knowledge and compassion. I said his methods involved significantly more violence than mine. He said only because my methods weren't available to people like him. If he'd been born into a different family, maybe he'd be in medical school too. I doubted that but didn't argue. On day 10 the doctors cleared him for discharge. Marcus arranged transport to a safe house outside the city. Somewhere Dante could finish recovering away from threats. Before he left he asked me something. He asked if I wanted to see his world. Really see it. Not just the hospital rooms and phone calls. The actual infrastructure. The businesses. The operations. He said he wanted me to understand what I was getting involved in before making any more decisions about staying in his life. I should have said no. Should have maintained whatever professional distance still existed between us. Dad, I said yes. 2 days later, Marcus picked me up in an inconspicuous sedan. Drove me to the industrial district, to a warehouse that looked abandoned from the outside. Inside it was a command center. Computers, monitors, people working with quiet intensity. Maps on walls showing territories, shipments, operations across the entire city. Dante sat at a desk near the back, still bandaged but more alert than I'd seen him. He stood when I entered, wincing slightly. He welcomed me to his office. Said this was where real decisions got made. I looked around at the organized chaos. Asked what exactly they were deciding. He explained. His family controlled logistics. Legitimate shipping companies that moved legal goods. But those same routes could move other things. Information. Money. People who needed to disappear. His family had spent decades perfecting this system. Now he was trying to transition everything to completely legal operations. But the infrastructure was valuable. Other organizations wanted it. Wanted to force him back into criminal activities or take over the operation entirely. That's why people kept trying to kill him. Because he represented change they didn't want. I asked how many people worked for him. He said directly, about 200. Indirectly, thousands. His family's businesses employed legitimate workers who had no idea about the other operations. I asked if he ever regretted it. Being born into this world. He said every single day. But regret didn't change reality. All he could do was try to make it better. He introduced me to his key people. Sophia, his financial manager, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. Luis, who handled legal logistics. Anna, who managed the legitimate shipping operations. Each of them studied me with obvious suspicion. Wondering who this college student was and why their boss was showing her classified information. Dante explained simply. He said I'd saved his life twice. Once from an ambush. Once by giving him a reason to keep fighting through recovery. He said I deserved to know what I'd saved. After the tour, he took me to his private office. Smaller. More personal. Photos on the desk. His sister, his mother, people I didn't recognize. He asked what I thought. I told him the truth. That it was more organized than I expected. More professional. That it looked like a legitimate business with very good security. He said that was the point. They were building something that could survive scrutiny. That could transition fully into the light. But it would take time. And every day people were trying to destroy it before it succeeded. I asked what he needed. What would help make the transition faster? He looked surprised by the question. Said most people asked how they could profit from his situation. Not how they could help. I said I wasn't most people. He smiled. Said he'd noticed. Then he asked me something that changed everything again. He asked if I'd consider working with him. Not now. After I graduated. After I became a doctor. He said his organization provided health care to people who couldn't access traditional systems. People who couldn't go to hospitals because of immigration status, criminal records, or simple poverty. They had doctors on staff. But they needed more. Needed people who actually cared about the patients rather than just collecting paychecks. He said I'd be perfect. If I wanted. No pressure. No obligation. Just an offer to think about. I asked if that would make me part of his organization. Complicit in whatever illegal activities still existed. He said honestly yes. Though his goal was to have everything legitimate by then. But he couldn't guarantee timing. I told him I'd think about it. He said that's all he asked. Marcus drove me back to campus. The whole ride I processed what I'd seen. The scale of Dante's operation. The number of people depending on him. The complexity of transitioning an empire from illegal to legal. And the danger. Always the danger. The constant threat that hung over everything he'd built. Amy was waiting when I got home. She sat me down, face serious. She said she needed the truth. About where I kept disappearing to. About the scholarship money. About the mysterious man sending me books and groceries. She said she was worried about me. That I'd changed. Become more secretive. More distant. She asked if I was in trouble. I wanted to lie. Wanted to keep her separate from this part of my life. But she was my best friend. She deserved honesty. I told her everything. About the ambush. About Dante. About the bomb. About falling for a man who lived in a world where people solved problems with violence. Amy listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question I'd been avoiding. She asked what I was going to do. If I was really considering a future with someone whose enemies planted car bombs. I said I didn't know. That my head told me to run. That this was dangerous and stupid and would probably end badly. But my heart told me something different. Amy hugged me, said she'd support whatever I decided. But she made me promise to be careful, to have an exit plan, to remember that I had a life and a future that existed independent of Dante Russo. I promised. But we both knew I was already in too deep to walk away easily. Dante invited me to dinner 6 weeks after the bombing. He'd recovered enough to move around normally, though I could see pain flicker across his face when he thought I wasn't looking. He said he wanted to introduce me to his family. Make things official. I asked what official meant. He said it meant acknowledging that I was important to him, that I was under his protection, that anyone who touched me would answer to him personally. I asked if that was wise, making me a bigger target. He said I was already a target the moment I'd saved him. Might as well make sure everyone knew hurting me meant war. The dinner was at his mother's house. A mansion in the estate district, the kind of place that screamed old money and older secrets. I wore the nicest dress I owned, which was still woefully inadequate for the setting. Felt like a scholarship kid playing dress-up. Dante met me at the door. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my car. But his smile was warm, genuine, designed to put me at ease. He told me I looked beautiful. I said I looked like I raided a clearance rack. He said he'd never cared about clothes. Only the person wearing them. Inside, the house was exactly what I expected. Elegant. Intimidating. Full of people who belonged to a world I'd never be part of. Dante's mother, Isabel Russo, was in her 60s but looked younger. Elegant, sharp-eyed, assessing me within seconds of introduction. She said so I was the girl who'd saved her son's life. Twice now, apparently. I said I'd just done what anyone would do. She laughed. Said most people ran from danger. I'd run toward it. She said that made me either very brave or very stupid. Time would tell which. There were others. Dante's uncle, who managed the financial side. His cousin, who handled West Side operations. Associates whose roles I didn't quite understand. All of them studied me like a curiosity. The college student who'd somehow become important to Dante Russo. Dinner was formal. Multiple courses. Conversation that danced around dangerous topics. Everyone was polite, but I felt the undercurrents. The assessments. The calculations. I was being evaluated. Judged. Measured against expectations I didn't know existed. After dinner, Isabel asked to speak with me privately. We went to her study and she closed the door. She asked me directly what my intentions were toward her son. I said I wasn't sure I had intentions. That we were friends. Maybe more. It was complicated. She said nothing about Dante was simple. That loving him meant accepting constant danger. Meant being used as leverage. Meant living with fear. She asked if I was prepared for that. I said no. I wasn't prepared at all. But I cared about him anyway. Couldn't seem to stop caring even when logic said I should. Isabel studied me for a long time. Then she told me a story. She said she'd loved Dante's father. Marco Russo had been handsome, powerful, magnetic. She'd married him at 20 thinking love would be enough. It hadn't been. She'd spent 40 years watching him build an empire on violence. Had lost friends, family members, her own peace of mind. Had buried her daughter 6 years ago. A daughter killed because of Marco's choices. She said she'd never forgive him for that. For bringing that violence home. For letting it touch their children. She asked if I wanted to risk the same thing. Risk bringing violence into my life. Risk losing people I loved because of choices Dante made. I said honestly I didn't know. That I was still figuring out what I wanted. But I knew Dante was trying to change. To leave violence behind. To build something better. Isabel smiled sadly. Said Marco had made the same promises. They all did. But violence was seductive. Hard to leave behind once you'd tasted power. She told me to be careful. To protect my heart. To remember that I had my whole life ahead of me and shouldn't throw it away for a man, no matter how much I loved him. Then she hugged me. Genuine. Maternal. She said she hoped I was strong enough to survive loving her son. That he needed someone like me. someone who saw past the violence to the man underneath. But she also hoped I was smart enough to walk away if necessary. When we returned to the dining room, Dante was waiting. He asked if his mother had scared me off yet. I said she'd tried, but I was still here. He looked relieved. On the drive home he apologized. Said family dinners were always intense. That his mother meant well but carried her own trauma. I asked about his sister. About what had really happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me the full story. Maria had been 19. Medical student like me. Brilliant. Kind. Everything good about their family. She'd been leaving class one evening. Wrong place. Wrong time. A rival organization had tried to kill Dante. She'd been nearby. Caught in the crossfire. She died in his arms. Her last words had been asking him to promise he'd make her death mean something. He'd been trying to keep that promise for 6 years. That's why he'd recognized me immediately. Why he'd protected me so fiercely. Why he'd set up the scholarship and sent books and cared so much about my success. I reminded him of Maria. Of what she could have been if she'd lived. I asked if that's why he cared about me. Because I was a substitute for his dead sister. He pulled the car over. Turned to look at me directly. He said it had started that way. Guilt and ghosts and the desperate need to save someone when he'd failed to save her. But it wasn't that anymore. I wasn't a substitute. I was myself. Sophiachin. Brave and stubborn and brilliant. He said he was falling in love with me. Not with my resemblance to Maria. With me. And he knew he shouldn't. Knew it put me in danger. Knew I deserved better than a man whose enemies planted bombs. But he couldn't stop himself. My heart hammered in my chest. I looked at this dangerous, damaged man who'd somehow become essential to my existence. I told him I was falling for him too. Had been since that first phone call. Maybe since that moment in the lecture hall when our eyes had met and I'd made the insane decision to save him. I said I knew it was stupid. Knew I should walk away. Knew every logical reason why this was doomed. But logic had never been my strong suit when it came to people I loved. He kissed me then. Slow and deep and full of everything we'd been avoiding saying for months. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, he told me he couldn't promise me safety. Couldn't promise me normal. Couldn't promise me anything except that he'd fight with everything he had to keep me alive. I said that was enough. That I'd take dangerous love over safe indifference any day. He said I was insane. I said I'd heard that before. We sat in his car in my apartment parking lot, wrapped around each other, and I felt the future shift. Felt possibilities and dangers align in equal measure. I was in love with a mafia boss. And God help me, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Finals week hit like a hurricane. I barely had time to breathe, let alone see Dante. We texted when I could. Brief check-ins. Promises to talk after exams ended. I passed everything. Barely. Exhaustion and distraction had taken their toll. Dante took me to dinner to celebrate. Expensive restaurant. Private room. The kind of place where they didn't list prices on the menu. I felt out of place in my Target dress, but Dante looked at me like I was wearing diamonds. He said he was proud of me. That finishing second year was an accomplishment most people couldn't achieve. I said I couldn't have done it without his help. Without the scholarship that let me focus on school instead of working 3 jobs. He said I'd have found a way. People like me always did. Over dessert he asked me something that made my stomach drop. He said he needed my help. Needed my medical expertise for something that couldn't go through normal channels. I asked what kind of help. He said one of his people had been injured. Shot during a confrontation. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it needed treatment. And they couldn't go to a hospital without alerting police. He said he had doctors on staff, but they were all currently unreachable. Emergency overseas. Time-sensitive situation. He needed me to treat the injury. Remove the bullet. Stitch the wound. Basic trauma care. I told him I was a second-year medical student. Not a surgeon. Not even close to qualified for something like that. He said I'd done trauma rotations. Had more hands-on experience than most students my age. had steady hands and a calm head in crisis. Most importantly, he trusted me. I asked what would happen if I refused. He said nothing. He'd find another way. Would never force me into something I wasn't comfortable with. But his eyes told a different story. He needed this. Desperately. I thought about what I was being asked. To provide illegal medical care. To remove evidence of a crime. To become actively complicit in whatever violence had caused this injury. Every piece of my medical ethics training screamed at me to refuse. But I looked at Dante, at the fear carefully hidden behind his calm exterior, and I knew I couldn't say no. I told him I'd do it. But I needed supplies. Proper medical equipment. Sterile environment. He said he had everything. Had prepared a room at one of his properties. Full surgical setup. Everything I might need. We left immediately. The property was a townhouse in the financial district. Expensive. Secure. The kind of place that didn't attract attention. Inside, Marcus was waiting. His face was grim. The injured man was in a bedroom converted into a makeshift operating room. He was young, maybe 25. Conscious but in obvious pain. Bullet wound to the shoulder. Clean entry, no exit. The bullet was still inside. Marcus introduced him as Tony. One of their security team. Good kid. Loyal. Tony looked at me with hope and fear mixed together. Asked if I knew what I was doing. I said mostly. Which wasn't reassuring, but it was honest. I scrubbed in using the equipment Dante had assembled. Everything was professional grade. He'd clearly prepared for situations like this. Removing the bullet took 90 minutes. My hands shook at first, but muscle memory from rotations took over. I worked slowly, carefully, talking myself through each step. Dante assisted. Following my instructions with surprising competence. Anticipating what I needed before I asked. When I finally extracted the bullet, dropping it into a metal bowl with a clink, everyone in the room exhaled. I stitched the wound, administered antibiotics, set up 4 fluids. Gave instructions for aftercare. Tony thanked me weakly. Said he owed me his life. I said he didn't. That I'd done what any doctor would do. But we both knew that wasn't true. Real doctors would have called the police. Would have reported a gunshot wound. I just crossed a line I'd never be able to uncross. After Tony was stable and resting, Dante walked me to his car. In the garage, away from everyone, he pulled me into his arms. He said thank you. That I'd saved Tony's life. That he knew what I'd just risked for his organization. I asked what had happened. How Tony got shot. Dante hesitated. Then told me the truth. The faction opposing his legitimacy plans had made another move. Attacked one of their warehouses. Tony had been on security duty. Had taken a bullet protecting Dante's property. I asked if anyone died. Dante said 2 of the attackers. His people had defended themselves. It had been clean. Legal technically. Self-defense on private property. But the police would ask questions. Would investigate. Would potentially uncover things that needed to stay hidden during the transition period. That's why they couldn't take Tony to a hospital. I asked how much longer this would continue. How much more violence before the transition was complete. Dante said he didn't know. Months. Maybe a year. His enemies were getting desperate, which made them dangerous. I told him I was scared. That this was bigger than I'd realized. More dangerous than I'd prepared for. He said I should be scared. That fear was healthy. Kept you alert. But he'd protect me. Would do everything in his power to keep me safe. I asked what happened if his power wasn't enough. He didn't have an answer for that. He drove me home as dawn was breaking. I was exhausted, covered in someone else's blood, complicit in activities I'd spent my whole life avoiding. Amy took one look at me and knew something had happened. She didn't ask questions. Just drew me a bath, made tea, sat with me while I stared at nothing. Later, after I'd slept, she asked if I was okay. I said no. I wasn't okay at all. But I was committed now. Had crossed too many lines to pretend I could go back to normal life. She asked if I loved him enough to justify all this. I said I didn't know if love justified anything. But it explained everything. She hugged me tight. Said she hoped I knew what I was doing. I didn't. Not even a little bit. But I was doing it anyway. The FBI came to campus 2 weeks later. I was in the library studying when 2 agents approached. Badges held high. Serious faces. They asked if I was Sophia Chin. My heart stopped. I nodded. They said they needed to ask me some questions. About my relationship with Dante Russo. We went to a private study room. They closed the door. Pulled out files filled with surveillance photos. There I was, entering Dante's warehouse. Visiting him in the hospital. Having dinner at his mother's house. Kissing him in his car. They'd been watching me. For months. One agent, a woman named Sarah Chin, spoke first. She said they'd been investigating the Russo organization for years. Building a RICO case. Getting close to something prosecutable. But Dante kept slipping away. Too smart. Too careful. Always one step ahead. Then I'd appeared. A college student with no criminal record. Clean background. Perfect grades. They said I was their way in. I asked what they meant. The other agent, Martinez, explained. They wanted me to cooperate. To share information about Dante's operations. To document what I saw, what I heard. In exchange, immunity. Protection. Financial compensation. Without my cooperation, they said I was looking at felony charges. Accessory to illegal firearms possession. Providing medical care to facilitate a crime. Obstruction of justice. I could go to prison. Lose my scholarship. Lose any chance at becoming a doctor. Or I could help them put Dante away and walk free. I sat there, files spread in front of me, looking at proof of every moment I'd shared with Dante being used against him. I asked how long they'd been watching me. Agent Chin said since November. Since I'd first visited Dante in the hospital. They tapped my phone. Followed me. Documented everything. I asked if they'd heard our conversations. Our private moments. Martinez said yes. Every word. Something cold settled in my chest. Not fear. Anger. I asked if I was under arrest. Chin said not yet. They were giving me a chance to cooperate voluntarily. I asked what would happen to Dante if I testified. Martinez said he'd go to prison. Probably life. His organization would collapse. Chin added that it was the right thing to do. That Dante Russo was a criminal. That people like him destroyed communities, corrupted systems, caused violence. She said I seemed like a good person. Asked why I was protecting someone who'd only bring me harm. I thought about how to answer. About everything I'd learned about Dante over the past months. About his attempts to go legitimate. His efforts to transition away from violence. His genuine desire to build something better. About the fact that he'd protected me, helped me, seen me when no one else had. About loving him despite knowing exactly what he was. I told them I wouldn't cooperate. Wouldn't testify. Wouldn't help them build a case against Dante. Chin asked if I understood the consequences. The charges I'd face. I said yes. I understood completely. Martinez got angry then. Said I was throwing my life away for a criminal. That loyalty to men like Dante Russo was misplaced and stupid. I said maybe. But it was my choice to make. They left, but not before warning me that the offer expired in 48 hours. After that, I'd be arrested. I sat in that study room for an hour after they left, hands shaking, trying to process what had just happened. I called Dante. Told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. That he'd known this might happen but had hoped his precautions would be enough. He said I should cooperate. Should testify. Should protect myself. I said absolutely not. He said I had my whole life ahead of me. Medical school. Career. Dreams. He wouldn't let me throw that away for him. I said it wasn't his choice. It was mine. He argued. Listed all the reasons I should save myself. All the ways this would destroy my future. I cut him off. Told him to shut up and listen. I told him I loved him. Had loved him for months, though I'd been too afraid to say it. I loved him for seeing me. For protecting me. for trying to be better than his legacy. I wouldn't betray him. Wouldn't help destroy everything he'd built. Wouldn't choose safety over loyalty to someone who'd never betrayed me. If that meant going to prison, so be it. He was silent. Then I heard him crying. This dangerous man who ran an empire, crying on the phone because I'd chosen him. He said he loved me too. Had loved me since that first moment in the lecture hall. Since I'd walked toward danger to save a stranger. He said he didn't deserve me. But he'd spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of my loyalty. I told him he already was. We stayed on the phone for an hour. Not talking. Just breathing together. Connected across the distance. Finally he said he had a plan. A way to protect me. It would require trust and risk, but it might work. I said I trusted him completely. He told me to come to the warehouse. Immediately. We had 48 hours to make me disappear. I drove to the warehouse with my heart in my throat. The city looked different now. Threatening. Full of federal agents and surveillance and traps I couldn't see. Marcus met me at the entrance. Rushed me inside with unusual urgency. The warehouse was in organized chaos. People moving with purpose. Computers being wiped. Documents being shredded. Everything that could incriminate was being destroyed. Dante stood in the center directing operations. When he saw me, relief flooded his face. He pulled me into a private office. Explained the plan. He'd arranged for me to leave the country. False identity. Medical school in Italy. Complete break from my old life. The FBI couldn't prosecute what they couldn't find. Once things cooled down, once the investigation shifted focus, I could come back. Resume my life. The scholarship would follow me abroad. It wasn't perfect, but it was survival. I asked how long I'd have to stay gone. He said he didn't know. A year. Maybe more. I asked if he'd come with me. He said no. He had to stay. Had to finish the transition. Had to protect his people. But he'd visit when he could. Would stay in contact. Would wait for me however long it took. I started to respond. To argue that there had to be another way. That's when the alarms went off. Marcus burst through the door. Said they had incoming. Multiple vehicles. Federal agents. They were raiding the warehouse. Dante swore. Said they weren't supposed to move this fast. Someone had tipped them off. Chaos erupted. People scrambling. Computers being destroyed faster. Dante shouting orders. He grabbed my hand. Said we needed to leave. No. We ran toward the back exit. Behind us, I heard doors crashing open. Shouting. The distinct sound of a federal raid in progress. We made it to the garage. Dante's car was waiting, engine running. Marcus was already in the driver's seat. We jumped in. Marcus peeled out, tires screaming. Behind us, federal vehicles poured into the warehouse. We'd escaped by seconds. Marcus drove like a man possessed. Taking side streets, doubling back, using every evasion tactic he knew. But they kept finding us. Kept appearing in our mirrors. Like they knew exactly where we'd go. Dante realized it first. Said there must be a tracker on the car. That they'd planted it during surveillance. He told Marcus to head for the industrial district. He had a property there. Secure. Off the books. We ditched the car in an alley. Ran on foot through rain-slicked streets. I lost a shoe somewhere, didn't stop to retrieve it. We made it to the property. An old factory Dante had converted into a safe house. Got inside. Locked down. Marcus checked for tracking devices. Found nothing. We were clean. For now. Dante immediately made calls. Trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Why the raid happened ahead of schedule. The answer came 20 minutes later. Sophia called. Her voice was shaking. Someone had betrayed them. One of Dante's inner circle had been working with the FBI. Had provided information, evidence, testimony. Everything the feds needed to raid and arrest. He said his name. The logistics manager. The one I'd met during my tour. He'd been wearing a wire for months. Recording everything. Building a case from the inside. Dante's face went absolutely cold. He asked where Luis was now. Sophia said in federal custody. Protected witness. Already in a secure location. Dante thanked her and hung up. He turned to Marcus. Told him to activate the contingency plans. Shut down operations. Get everyone to safety. This war was over. They'd lost. Marcus argued. Said they could fight. Could recover. Could rebuild. Dante said no. Too many people had already been hurt. He wouldn't risk more casualties for pride. It was time to surrender. I asked what that meant. What would happen to him? He said he'd likely go to prison. His lawyers would negotiate terms, but with Luis's testimony, conviction was almost certain. I asked what would happen to me. He said I'd still leave the country. Tonight. The plan hadn't changed. I'd be safe. Would finish medical school. Would have the life he couldn't give me. I told him I wasn't leaving. Wasn't running while he faced this alone. He said I didn't have a choice. The feds wanted me to. If I stayed, I'd be arrested. I said then I'd be arrested. Would face charges alongside him. Would refuse to testify, take whatever consequences came. He grabbed my shoulders. Looked at me with desperate intensity. He said I was being stupid. That throwing away my future wouldn't help him. Wouldn't change anything. That the best way to honor what we'd had was to survive. To become the doctor I was meant to be. To live the life his sister never got to live. I was crying now. Telling him I couldn't leave him. Couldn't just abandon him to save myself. He kissed me. Hard. Desperate. Like he was trying to memorize the taste of me. When he pulled back, he said this was love. Real love. Protecting each other even when it hurt. He said if I loved him, I'd get on that plane. Would live. Would make all of this mean something. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Said the transport was ready. They needed to leave in 5 minutes. Dante handed me a passport. False name. Perfect forgery. Tickets to Rome. Cash for expenses. Everything I needed to disappear. I told him I loved him. That I'd wait for him. However long it took. He said he loved me too. That I'd saved him in ways that had nothing to do with that first ambush. That I'd reminded him what he was fighting for. Why going legitimate mattered. Why some things were worth any sacrifice. Marcus practically carried me to the car. I looked back, seeing Dante standing in the doorway of the safe house watching me leave. Our eyes met one last time. Then Marcus pulled away and Dante disappeared into the darkness. I cried the entire drive to the airport. Marcus said nothing. Just drove with grim determination. At the terminal, he handed me final instructions. How to contact him. Emergency numbers. Ways to get messages to Dante. He said Dante would be okay. That his lawyers were the best. That this wasn't over. But we both knew it was a comfortable lie. I boarded the plane to Rome with someone else's name, someone else's identity, leaving behind the only man I'd ever loved. As we took off, I watched the city shrink below me. That city where I'd become Sophia Chin, medical student. Where I'd saved a stranger and lost my heart. I didn't know if I'd ever see Dante again. Didn't know if he'd survive prison, if we'd survive the separation, if love could endure what was coming. All I knew was that I'd made my choice. Had protected him by leaving. Had chosen his survival over my own desires. And somehow that felt like both the rightest and wrongest decision I'd ever made. I spent 6 months in Rome. The medical school was prestigious. Challenging. Everything I'd dreamed of. And I was miserable. I went through motions. Attended lectures. Passed exams. Smiled when appropriate. But part of me remained in that warehouse. In Dante's arms. In a life I'd abandoned to keep him safe. Marcus sent updates when he could. Encoded messages that took me hours to decipher. Dante had been arrested. Charged with racketeering, conspiracy, a dozen other crimes. His lawyers had negotiated a deal. 10 years with possibility of parole. Better than life. Still devastating. The trial happened without me. Luis's testimony was damning. Other evidence sealed Dante's fate. He went to prison in March. I wanted to fly home. To be there. To support him however I could. Marcus said no. The feds were still watching. Still hoping I'd surface. My absence was the only thing keeping me safe. So I stayed in Rome. Studied medicine. Lived half a life. I made one friend. Another American student named Grace. She knew I was running from something but never pressed for details. She just understood that some people carried ghosts. In May I got a letter. Forwarded through 3 different addresses. Untraceable. Dante's handwriting. Elegant. Controlled. He said he was surviving. That prison was exactly as terrible as expected. But he was safe. Protected by reputation and old alliances. He said he thought about me every day. About the night I'd saved him. About our conversations and dinners and stolen moments. He said I'd given him something he'd never had before. Hope that he could be more than his father's legacy. More than violence and power. He said I should move on. Should find someone safer. Should build the life I deserved without waiting for a criminal serving 10 years. But if I couldn't move on, if I was as stubborn as he remembered, he'd wait for me. Would count down days until he could see me again. The letter ended with 3 words. Semper tua. Always yours. I cried reading it. Clutched that piece of paper like it was scripture. Then I made my decision. I called Marcus. Told him I was coming home. He argued. Said it wasn't safe. The investigation was still active. I could still be charged. I said I didn't care. I'd spent 6 months running. 6 months being safe while the man I loved rotted in prison. I was done running. Marcus sighed. Said he'd been waiting for this call. Had known I wouldn't stay away forever. He said things had changed. The FBI's focus had shifted. Luis's testimony had satisfied most of their objectives. They weren't actively looking for me anymore. I could come home. Carefully. Quietly. Resume my life. But I'd have to stay away from anything connected to Dante's old organization. Any contact with his associates would trigger renewed investigation. I agreed to the terms. 2 weeks later I was back in the city. Back at my old university. Resuming medical school like I'd just taken a brief leave of absence. Amy hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. Said she'd missed me. That nothing had been the same without me. I moved into a new apartment. Different neighborhood. Clean slate. I couldn't visit Dante. Prison regulations were strict. And federal monitoring meant any contact would be documented. But Marcus found ways to pass messages. Letters that took circuitous routes. Updates on Dante's condition. Reassurances that he was surviving. I threw myself into medicine with new intensity. If I couldn't be with Dante, I could at least honor what we'd been trying to build. I volunteered at free clinics. Treated patients who couldn't afford traditional health care. The same population Dante's organization had served. I kept my promise. Became the doctor his sister had wanted to be. Years passed. 3rd year. 4th year. Residency. I dated occasionally. Tried to move on like Dante had suggested. But no one compared. No one saw me the way he had. No one made me feel alive like those dangerous, beautiful months we'd shared. In my 5th year of residency, Marcus called with news that changed everything. Dante was being released. Early parole. Good behavior and overcrowding had cut his sentence in half. He'd be free in 6 weeks. I asked if he knew I was back. If he knew I'd waited. Marcus said yes. That Dante had known for years. That my letters, the ones I'd sent through Marcus's network, had kept him alive. He asked if I wanted to see Dante when he was released. I said yes. More than anything. Marcus told me where to be. When to arrive. How to stay off federal radar. Then he said one more thing. He said Dante had changed. Prison did that to people. Made them harder. More careful. Less trusting. He wasn't the same man I'd known. I said I'd changed too. That we'd both survived impossible circumstances. Maybe that was enough. I waited outside the prison on a gray April morning. 5 years after I'd last seen Dante. 5 years of letters and longing and half-lived lives. The gates opened at 8 a.m. Men filtered out. Some met by family. Some alone. All looking dazed by freedom. Then I saw him. Dante Russo. Older. Thinner. Harder around the edges. But unmistakably him. Our eyes met across the parking lot. For a moment we just stared. Taking each other in. Processing the reality of this moment we'd imagined for years. Then he was moving. Walking toward me with increasing speed. And I was running, closing the distance, throwing myself into arms that caught me like I was something precious he'd thought he'd lost forever. We held each other in that prison parking lot, both crying, both laughing, both unable to believe this was real. He pulled back to look at me. Touched my face like he needed to confirm I was solid. He said my name. Sylvia. I said his. He asked what I was doing there. Told me I was supposed to have walked out and not stopped. If you've ever believed in finding love in unexpected places, subscribe and comment on any experiences you may have of finding love in places you'd have never guessed.